Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our ongoing Tuesday Talk series here at the DAR Museum. My name's Kevin. I'm the Curator of Education. I'm so excited. I've been looking forward to this all week and all day. Really quickly, if you have discovered this through different means and you've never heard of the DAR Museum, DAR stands for the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is a heritage organization dedicated to preserving and educating and celebrating the American Revolution. And the members are people who have ancestors who supported the American Revolution in some way. And now they're this great philanthropic organization that, in addition to the many things it does, helps operate this museum here in Washington, D.C., this beautiful place. And our Tuesday Talk series is an ongoing series of lectures where we bring in an expert to talk to us about some specific aspect of history. And this one is not something we've really done before. We're going to be talking with Rebecca Quam about femininity, motherhood, and women with disabilities, and her research that she has completed recently about this topic historically. So I think for me, this is going to be a great exploration into a new area of learning that I haven't spent a lot of time with, and I think it's going to be really cool for everybody else joining us. So if you're not familiar with, or you don't remember Rebecca Quam, Becca is I guess you could say Becca is an alum of the DAR Museum. She's a museum professional who's been doing work in Washington, D.C. for a few years. Currently, she's at the Washington National Cathedral as a docent tour manager. She's been, like I said, in museums all throughout the city. Her bachelor's is from St. Mary's College in California. Her master's is in public history from American University, which I can personally say is a great program, and then recently completed an advanced certificate in disability studies from the City University of New York. So Becca does a lot of material history looking at conflict and societal change, and she does a lot of great interpretation educational efforts at historic sites like the DAR Museum and the Washington National Cathedral. And this is Becca. Becca, we're so happy to have you back. It's been 3 weeks.
I'm so excited to be back. So this is a great day. I'm really excited about this.
So Becca, I'm going to let you take it away, but just for folks who are in the Zoom here, if you're having any issues, go ahead and pop it in the chat. I'm going to let Becca take the spotlight, but I'll be monitoring the chat for any issues. And if you have any questions for Becca as you go, there's a separate button that says Q&A. You can click that and put your question there, and that'll be a nice separate space where we'll talk. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time to chat afterwards. So.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, I am an alum of the DAR Museum, and I'm excited to come back and to participate in the Tuesday Talk lecture. And thank you to the DAR Museum for having me today. And thank you all for coming today as we look at perceptions of disabled women and motherhood. This presentation is a culmination of a lot of personal research and exploration, and is just a small fragment of the research that can be done connecting material culture, social and cultural histories, and their effects on the disability community. This is also the perfect month to discuss this topic, as we are in the midst of Women's History Month and Disability Awareness Month. So this intersection of commemoration is a great time to look more deeply at disabled women, disabled mothers, and the role that American society had in creating definitions of the competent mother. Now, I want to start this lecture by discussing a Supreme Court case from the early 20th century. There we go. The case centered on the treatment of a woman named Carrie Buck by her doctor, John Bell. And this is actually an image of Carrie with her biological mother, Emma. Carrie Buck was institutionalized in 1924 at the State Colony of Epileptics and Feeble-Minded in Virginia. She sued Bell, the superintendent of the institution, when he determined that she should be sterilized because she was, quote, feeble-minded. Her case made it to the US Supreme Court, and in an 8-1 decision, the court found that John Bell did not violate Carrie's constitutional rights. More specifically, that the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924 did not violate the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion of the court, quote, "The judgment finds the facts that have been recited, and that Carrie Buck is the probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization," and thereupon makes the order. "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." This case and those words would be used as justification for heinous acts like the forced sterilization of 70,000 Americans, and was used during the Nuremberg trials following World War II to condone Nazi terror. And yet, what was not mentioned in the case was that Carrie was deemed feeble-minded due to having a child outside of marriage, a daughter named Vivian, as a result of sexual assault and rape. Carrie's lawyers were also closely connected to Bell and the colony itself, so her lawyers also had ulterior motives. In 1927, at the age of 21, doctors performed a self-injectomy on Carrie Buck. This case and its effects on American society demonstrate the construction of the competent mother in the 19th and 20th centuries. This included definitions of those deemed adequate to take on that role. As evident by Carrie Buck, disabled women, or those deemed disabled by those in power, were not fit. Or, as described by scholar Angela Frederick, quote, "Non-normative mothers, including women of color, poor mothers, queer mothers, and women with disabilities, come under particular scrutiny as they are systematically defined as risky mothers who are inadequate for the task of ideal mothering." Historical analyses of true womanhood and the culture of domesticity are vast and have unveiled the deeply rooted and stereotypical perceptions of male and female roles in American society. Through a feminist lens, these roles were and continue to be damaging to women in American culture. These definitions dictated both the proper roles of women and mothers in American society. These roles are introduced at a young age and are reinforced through a woman's life. Often, these gender definitions focused on a woman's physical abilities and specified roles within the home, which included, quote, her ability to clean the house, do laundry, prepare meals, sew clothes, milk cows, and gather eggs, suggesting the ability to adhere to heteronormative definitions of femininity, end quote. These definitions were actually taken from a competency trial in the 19th century, and these standards were used to classify a visually impaired woman named Emma Killian incompetent, along with her disabilities and most likely her single status. She was unmarried when her cousin brought suit against her. What is clear from these definitions of gender roles is that disabled women in particular were often excluded from these definitions. To me, this brings up major questions when considering disability and motherhood. How did concepts of womanhood and motherhood connect to women with disabilities? Do disabled women fit into the socially constructed definition of motherhood? And how did the material culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries affect a disabled woman's everyday life? To understand the social and cultural perceptions of motherhood, analyzing material culture can reveal how the American public defined these roles. By analyzing historic scholarship and material culture, definitions and perceptions of the competent mother and woman become very clear. These definitions actively excluded women with disabilities, both physical and socially constructed. For the purpose of this lecture, analysis has been narrowed to the 1870s to the 1920s to fit with the time periods focused on at the DAR Museum. I did conduct research going further into the 20th century, specifically the effect of Dr. Benjamin Spock and the Spockian mother, and the greater effects of the eugenics movement for disabled mothers in the 21st century. But that is definitely for another lecture. I could go on for hours about that topic in particular. So this lecture will look both thematically and chronologically at how prevalent societal ideals, material culture, major historical moments reinforced and helped to define the normal, competent mother, whose definition did not include disabled women. Now, before I get any further, I did want to provide a bit of a disclaimer. Some of the language used in this lecture may be uncomfortable and difficult to hear. In the years I'll be discussing, again, 1870s through the 1920s, there are many outdated, discriminatory, and unacceptable phrases attached to the disability community. We have already heard a few when considering Carrie Buck. It is important to understand the power of language. And as stated by scholar Simi Linton in her work Claiming Disability, the medical meaning-making was negotiated among interested parties who packaged their version of disability in ways that increased the idea's potency and marketability. The disability community has attempted to wrest control of the language from the previous owners and reassign meaning to the terminology used to describe disability and disabled people. I will be providing an open and honest dialogue about perceptions of disability as seen in material culture during these decades, and many of these ideas are still present in modern day society. Now, let's get started looking at some of these objects, and let's start looking at material culture, and let's really start at kind of the beginning, and let's start with childhood. Starting at a young age, children are confronted with societal perceptions of femininity and masculinity. The clothes they wear, the toys they play with, the education they receive is often dictated by these societal norms. These depictions reinforce gender roles in American society for children. Strong, confident, moral, able bodies were the norm and the goal. Girls in American society are taught at a young age about perceptions of beauty and what it takes to be the ideal American woman. This is reinforced with societal ideals and cultural representations. Oftentimes, it starts with the toys that young girls play with. Children have been playing with paper dolls for hundreds and hundreds of years. Girls can create their ideal woman and give her the outfit and hobbies that they consider ideal. Most of these paper dolls have a very similar look. They are often tall, economically well off, and interested in some of the most fashionable hobbies, including horseback riding and tennis, which I found in examples from the 1930s, so just after the decades I will be discussing today. These dolls are usually white, and they are able-bodied. The creation of the ideal mother starts with the creation of the ideal woman. So in these two examples on the screen, we have one paper doll from the Smithsonian that shows a woman in a beautiful white veiled dress, which you can kind of assume is a wedding dress, already the role of wife and mother. And the other example taken from the DAR Museum, the child who's playing with this has the option to choose what they want to see in that doll in itself. Do they want to be in the green dress? Do they want to have the hat on or not? Things like that. With popular toys like paper dolls, societal ideas are being reinforced. By this understanding, women with disabilities could not achieve this ideal womanhood in American society. While perceptions of beauty are introduced very early in life, so is motherhood. Probably one of the most common and widely used toys are dolls, and many of these dolls include a stroller or doll carriage. This example is from 1882. To use the carriage, there is a level of physical ability required. Children needed to physically move the carriage to use it. They were also introduced to motherhood and their future role at this very young age. Children were encouraged to take the role of mother seriously from this young age, setting the foundation for the importance of the able-bodied mother. Now, as young girls grow up, and as you've already seen, an emphasis is placed on health and beauty. Historically, health and beauty are interconnected. That still remains a prevalent societal norm. Shoppers could find a variety of items in a pharmacy, from salves to tonics to makeup. The connection between health and beauty and the efforts of advertisements reinforce the ideal American woman. These representations did not include disabled women. Companies and individuals advertised and attempted to trademark remedies that cured any and all ailments. This example to me is very interesting, but also reflective of what was available to the general public. This is a trademark registration by Chase and Fitchett for George Chase's mixture. And what did this mixture do? It was a remedy for general debility. That's all it says it does. So not very clear on what actually it heals or what its intention is, things like that. So while it does not explicitly state what this mixture would actually heal, it generalizes on and promises good health to consumers. And here are a few more examples. Advertisements focused on the miracle cures of these over-the-counter offerings. In this example, the woman in the advertisement states, "I owe my restoration to health and beauty to the Cuticura remedies." Now, what's interesting is if you look below that image of a woman and her claim, you can actually see what this soap and what this remedy actually is supposedly curing. And that ranges from itching and burning tortures to sore eyes to diseases of the skin and scalp. Again, very interesting, but as we look at the trade card and look at the representation of the woman on the trade card, we can see that these remedies relied on the constructive norm of female beauty, which included clear skin, thick hair, and no visible disability or impairment. Now, many of these products attempted to cure simple diagnoses as well as more concerning and chronic conditions, including blood disease and infantile or birth humors. Again, this is an actual advertisement from Cuticura. And again, ranging from skin and blood disease to pimples as the cure. So the connection, again, between health and beauty normalize the quick fix remedy and beauty standards that did not include disabled women. Society determined beauty standards for both men and women through advertising and marketing ventures. Brands made connections between outward appearance, health, and morality that affected these beauty standards. These beauty ideals elevated and simultaneously excluded certain women, including women with disabilities. As mentioned a little while ago, the creation of the ideal mother starts with the creation of the ideal woman. After this foundation is set, young women had to learn even more thoroughly about the definition of the normal, competent mother. Now, much in the vein of Dr. Spock and more modern day example, what to expect when you're expecting, etiquette and how-to books held a very prominent place in American society in the early 20th century. Individuals published books on childcare, pregnancy, and how to be a good mother. It is evident in these publications that eugenics and perceptions of competent motherhood dominate the language. While many may immediately think of figures prominent in the mid to late 20th century, i.e. Dr. Spock, when considering these types of publications, there are many earlier examples that demonstrate the hold of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. And while conducting my research, this was really the space where so much was uncovered in terms of representations of competent motherhood, and was one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence to really search through and analyze. So here are some examples. Published in 1906, Home Nursing, Motherhood, Care of Children includes language that is actually beneficial to future mothers, and even discusses how chronic illness and depressive episodes can be affected during pregnancy. However, it also states, quote, "Nature has wonderfully accommodated these organs and the entire mechanism of the body to this function," meaning pregnancy and motherhood, "and only asks to be given fair play. If a woman's life is normal, healthful, and wholesome, which ought to be one and the same thing, the fact that she is to bear a child need bring about no radical change." Now, Susanna Croft published Motherhood in 1911 and explicitly states that potential parents should strongly consider eugenics in the decision to have children. Quote, "She should realize that she is fulfilling her duty in the broad and general sense of the perpetuation of the race, and to this end, as well as to the more personal end of the child, her family, and herself, she should see to it that every physical law of conception and of growth is observed. She should study intelligently the laws of eugenics, that she may bear a physically sound child." And finally, Anne Newton published Mother and Baby, Helpful Suggestions Concerning Motherhood and the Care of Children in 1912. The author states, "The mental, moral, and physical well-being of children is so largely in the hands of the parents, and so much depends upon the attitude they take, that we may venture to say that it is practically impossible for women who will not exercise or keep their minds occupied in a normal, legitimate manner to have healthy or satisfactory children." Now, there are many common themes in these texts, including normalcy, good health, and biological fitness, to name a few. While there is some useful information for expectant mothers, and at least 2 of these publications were written by women, it's important to note that most publications and experts in the field at this time were considered men. These publications, though, were geared toward a specific audience: middle to upper class, white, able-bodied women. All of these examples demonstrate how these publications are greatly influenced by the eugenics movement and rely heavily on normative constructions of motherhood. While this literature was intended to support and prepare new mothers for pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing, it in fact reinforced and perpetuated discriminatory considerations of motherhood and gender roles. These books focused on the roles of women before, during, and after pregnancy. Physical activity, good moral standing, and a strong family medical history dictated who was adequate for motherhood. Disabled women were not included in this definition, and in many situations were discouraged from pursuing motherhood. The push to exclude disabled women gained momentum with the rise of institutions and strengthening eugenics ideals in American society. The clearest and most definitive perceptions on women with disabilities and motherhood came with the advent of the eugenics movement and institutionalization. Laws and physical spaces were created that closely followed the eugenics movement. Local organizations vocalized the desire to segregate women with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Or, with the prevalent language of the 19th and early 20th century, those considered feeble-minded. The language advocating for institutionalization is very clear about the perceptions of disabled women and motherhood. The two were not compatible. Sir Francis Galton published Inquiries into Human Faculty in 1883 and officially coined the phrase eugenics. In 1907, Galton delivered the Herbert Spencer Lecture at Oxford University entitled Probability, the Foundation of Eugenics. He provided context to the formation of eugenics itself. Quote, "In giving the following sketch of the history of eugenics, I am obliged to be egotistical because I kindled the feeble flame that struggled doubtfully for a time until it caught hold of adjacent stores of suitable material and became a brisk fire burning freely by itself. And again, because I have had much to do with its progress quite recently." After reading this quote, I felt that it is well represented in this magazine cover. Actually, take a moment just to observe. Now, this magazine cover is from Puck magazine, and it was published in 1913. Now, Puck is a satirical magazine, but it's really evident of how strong the eugenics movement was, both in the United States, but also going on a more international stage. Looking at the image, you see an older gentleman laying on his back with the globe balancing on his feet. You can see just kind of in front of him, you see he has a doctor's bag. And right next to him, you see a cherub with a broken arrow. So thinking of Cupid and how the cherub Cupid would cause romantic connections, that's no longer happening because, as stated in the magazine cover, eugenics makes the world go round. And also at this point, I think it's very important to acknowledge that while the term eugenics is actually a more recent addition to the English language, the ideas and framework of this movement have been in existence for thousands of years. We can see examples of this in published firsthand accounts and in the items that the general public were absorbing and have already seen. Now, firsthand accounts in particular unveil both the treatment of and reasoning behind placing women in institutions. Elizabeth Packard published Modern Persecution in 1873, 10 years before Galton's publication, and it was published after her release from the Jacksonville State Asylum. She details what she calls her abduction and her children's reactions to it. She states that her children would be motherless, and her children exclaim that they, quote, "have no mother." You could actually see a representation of that in this image taken from the publication itself. You see her two children sitting in a horse and carriage, and the caption states, "George, we have no mother." These reactions highlight both the familial fear of losing a family member, but also the deeper societal implications of disability, insanity, and motherhood. Now, once she entered the institution, Elizabeth had a lot of insights regarding her personal fears of institutionalization and societal stigma, especially towards her children. Her mentality surrounding her institutionalization speaks volumes to perceptions of inherited traits. And here is a quote from her book. "But one though there was, more dreadful to my sensitive feelings than all others, now these dear children, these dear fragments of myself, must be exposed to bear the dismal, dreadful taint of hereditary insanity. For their mother now lodges amid the hated walls of an insane asylum as an inmate." She feared the stigma surrounding her time in the institution, and she also feared the greater implication of shame and inadequacy for both herself and her children. She then states the societal teachings that many of her these children, including her own, would learn because of their mother's institutionalization. These children are taught to regard their mother as a worthless being because she had the cruel brand of insanity placed upon her by her husband, signed and sealed by a corrupt public servant whom a blinded public were regarding as an almost infallible man. Thus have the holiest ties of nature been most ruthlessly sundered by the perfidy of this perverted institution. Now, Elizabeth pinpoints important societal and moral teachings concerning mothers. They need to be morally upstanding. The connection between mother and child is of utmost importance, and mothers who are institutionalized or have a family history of institutionalization do not adhere to the socially constructed good or competent mother. And in this image taken from her book as well, Elizabeth, that central image shows Elizabeth being carried off by the local townspeople. And there are two smaller images just above her showing the reactions of her children. That central image, the caption reads, "Kidnapping Mrs. Packard. Is there no man in this crowd to protect this woman?" In image number 1, the caption reads, "And this is the protection you promised my mother? What is your gas worth to me?" And in image 2, or number 2, the caption reads, "I will get my dear mama out of prison. My mama shan't be locked up in prison." Now, firsthand accounts are telling examples of constructions surrounding motherhood. With the rise of the eugenics movement, groups and organizations pushed for the creation of new hospitals and institutions for those considered feeble-minded. The League for Preventative Work, based in Massachusetts, published this pamphlet in 1916 with an argument to create another school for the feeble-minded. It argues that the state needs an additional school because there are too many feeble-minded individuals living in society, which, quote, "does not prevent the transmission of their weakness to new generations," end quote. According to this group, the state needed another school to absolutely prevent the birth of a new generation. Direct quote from Feeble-Minded Adrift. Societal notions of motherhood and eugenics led many organizations to advocate for the segregation and often sterilization of those considered inferior. This definition of inferiority included those deemed feeble-minded, insane, or disabled. Now, these ideals remained prominent during some of the most pivotal moments in the early 20th century. Within the first few decades of the 20th century, significant events affected many of the roles relegated to men and women. These moments both upended and reinforced these norms. With these unstable gender roles and monumental historic moments, disabled women were again excluded as the moralistic, loyal, and able-bodied woman took precedence. At the turn of the 20th century, significant events reinforced the societal need for moralistic and strong mothers. Within many aspects of a woman's role in society, morality played an important part in dictating competent mothers. During World War I, women's roles were laid out in propaganda posters. These posters emphasized and valorized the stalwart and loyal woman and mother supporting the soldiers across the seas. One poster, published by the American Red Cross, shows a nurse cradling a wounded soldier, and she is labeled the greatest mother in the world. At the same time, women and mothers were pitiable, dependent, and worth fighting for. In the other poster, a mother holds her infant and her young child stands next to her. She looks tired, she looks defeated, and according to the poster, she demonstrates one reason for food conservation. During World War I, the American government and other organizations defined and outlined the necessary roles that women needed to play by publishing propaganda that included strong, resilient, and able-bodied women to the world. This highlighted the prevalence of the competent mother in American society and how the United States wanted to project itself on the world stage. While the United States utilized propaganda to reinforce and sustain perceptions of normality and definitions of the competent mother, they also used legislation and institutions to perpetuate these ideals. The United States sterilized nearly 70,000 Americans, with these laws continuing in some states into the 1970s. Sterilization and eugenics advocates, including Dr. A.J. Priddy of the Virginia State Colony for the Feeble-Minded, which might sound familiar. It is the same institution that Carrie Buck was institutionalized. Now, Dr. Priddy had clear and explicit motives for their actions, the institution's actions. Direct quote, "Sterilization of the feeble-minded served a threefold purpose. First, it served a eugenic function by preventing the continuation of hereditary mental defectiveness. Secondly, it provided a means of upholding morality by offering protection for those in society and the individual who was sterilized. Finally, sterilization provided a cost-effective method of handling the increasing numbers of feeble-minded individuals institutionalized in the Virginia colony. Once sterilized, feeble-minded colony patients could be discharged and live in the community without the potentiality of their bearing feeble-minded offspring." As seen, institutions physically removed women with disabilities from public life. According to legislators and physicians, women with disabilities were not suitable for motherhood and family life. The eugenics movement and sterilization furthered these beliefs and were widely accepted within American society. The eugenics movement went beyond legislation, and it continued well into the 20th century. Society embraced the movement with better baby contests and other cultural representations seen throughout daily life. Now, this example on the screen is from 1930. It's a very, very, very edge of my timeline, but these contests were definitely seen before 1930 and after 1930. So they're very prominent features in American society. And these Better Baby contests aim to find the healthiest and most desirable children. So well into the 20th century, perceptions surrounding motherhood, femininity, and creation of the perfect race had profoundly negative and dire effects on disabled women. These women were left out of the definitions of competent mothers, and society made a significant effort to keep them out of the conversation. Societal ideals of femininity and motherhood at the turn of the century detailed specific physical, moral, and mental traits that women needed to follow. Material culture, literature, and major events perpetuated these ideas well into the 20th century. Advertisers, manufacturers, authors, and individuals in power dictated the gender roles for both men and women. The important nuance within these definitions is that these roles were reserved for able-bodied women, and any deviance from this constructed norm affected the societal and personal reaction to actual and perceived disability. Disabled women were actively removed from representations of motherhood through both physical and cultural means. By excluding this demographic, greater American society received disparaging and discriminatory messages regarding women who went against the constructed norm. I want to thank you all so much for letting me talk at you for the last 40 minutes or so. And right now is kind of the Q&A portion of the lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and I'd be more than happy to answer them for you.
Becca, I thought that was incredible. And while people think of a question they may want to ask, I just want to say the thing that kept sort of haunting me throughout your presentation between the images and what you were saying was how strikingly familiar a lot of this felt. Particularly, I think the one that sort of gave me almost a chill was doll culture and how that may be affecting girls and young women. And also the snake oil that promises to help women with a variety of their perceived or real health internally and externally. All of that felt strikingly familiar. Did you have the same experience when you were doing the research?
Absolutely. This was a kind of passion project of mine and was something that was very close to me, as I personally am also a disabled woman. And so it was really important for me to see where the foundations of these ideas that honestly I've experienced in my life, where that really came from. And for me, I will say the couple of areas that really stuck out to me were the advertisements, as you mentioned, Kevin. Again, from pimples to blood disease, just how it really is just like we can hear all of this, but the greater implication is if it doesn't cure you, you are the other. You're not adequate enough, because seeing the trade card with the beautiful woman saying that I was fixed by this cure-all, if you personally can't get fixed, you aren't acceptable and you are inferior. That's a greater implication. And then the other piece that was really interesting to read about, as I mentioned, were the how-to books. Because growing up, 21st century, a lot of it was what to expect when you're expecting. And this is the book that you need to see, and learning about Dr. Spock and all of these different books that did have some credible information. Like the first book that did say that, depressive episodes and chronic illnesses could be affected during pregnancy. Wow. So important to learn about and to understand, but then also to say that being normal is going to give you the best pregnancy possible. So it's that, it's almost there, but it's relying on a method of thinking that, in my opinion, is unacceptable and discriminatory. So.
Wow. So Sarah Elizabeth has a question here in the Q&A talking about the Central State Hospital in Virginia, which is one of sort of the legacy inheritors. I'm not sure if you can answer the question. I'm just asking about how this oversight might continue to the present day, especially we know a lot of people stuck in the criminal legal system are coerced into things or not aware of their rights. Is that something that you came upon during your research?
So I found a little bit on that, and from my own personal research, I learned about Willowbrook. I learned about so many of these institutions that are being shut down, and even the example of the Virginia colony, as mentioned, they used the same building up until 2020 when it was finally shut down, and they just changed the name. It was the Central Virginia Training Center, I believe is the actual title. And so that same structure that was, founded and first kind of risen up in 1910, 1911 was in use until 2020. So Sarah Elizabeth, in terms of oversight, I know that the federal government does have some control and has been working along with private organizations and private individuals. It is important to understand and to acknowledge those activists and the survivors of many of these institutions who have fought so hard to get many of these sites closed down or have greater oversight. So I don't necessarily know specifically for the Central State Hospital in Virginia, but I do know that there is work, especially by advocates and private organizations, to hold them accountable and to protect those individuals who are actually institutionalized in those spaces.
I thought it was so important that you brought up Buck v. Bell, because its sort of legacy is so much more widespread. I mean, Virginia's own eugenics program in the United States, but that the Nazis used it to defend themselves after the war, that they didn't commit war crimes because they were doing what the United States was doing for all these years. It's a shocking turn of history, and it's very, very real consequences on Americans and also on a significant portion of the entire world as well.
Absolutely. And it's, in my opinion, it's something that we don't necessarily hear a lot about. The fact that eugenics was coined and created by an English scholar, that it had a really deep history in both Western Europe and in the United States. But also it's important to acknowledge that the kind of ideas surrounding the eugenics movement, some of these ideas have been definitely prevalent and present in world society for thousands of years. And Sir Francis Galton just put a name to it. So it really is, in terms of Buck v. Bell, to me, that really showed, and with the opinions written by Justice Holmes, it really showed how the ideas were both seen on a more legislative level, but also definitely as seen through the material culture. It's definitely seen in both kind of the more governmental side of things and in the societal kind of general public side of things as well.
And so your research and experience with disability history, how has that affected your work as a museum professional?
Great question, great question. So there's so many different elements of history that can include the disability experience. As we've seen throughout history, disabled individuals have always been present. So when I think of my work as a professional, it's elevating those stories. And honestly, everyone at some point in their life, in my opinion, will experience some type of disability, even if it's breaking a finger, breaking your ankle, or having something more along the lines of a chronic illness. There is an element of almost a universal experience when it comes to disability. And so it's really important that when you look at an exhibit or when you look at a recreation of a space, it's really important just to be mindful of where disabled men and women and individuals, where they would have fit in the space, and then to elevate their stories in a way that's not just, okay, we're throwing it in there just for it to be in there, for it to be actually like all connected together. I think that's what's really important for me, is that it's all connected into the greater narrative that has been created. But that's one thing that has been really important for me in terms of the actual interpretation side of things. And then also just on a more kind of practical, physical accessibility side of things. If you have these stories, you need to make sure that the individuals who are stakeholders in that history can actually access this space and access that history. So it's also understanding and acknowledging the importance of accessibility in all forms, which sometimes can be very difficult because the disability community is so diverse. So there's a lot of considerations, but it is important to make those steps to ensure that they feel welcome to come and to learn their history and to be a stakeholder in that history.
That's an incredible point, and as you know, agree. But that's the question of how do we make a better museum is a lot of it starts in content, but also physically in your space, and then just answering that question of who feels comfortable in your space and who doesn't, and how do you change that. And to sort of the point about one of the comments left in the Q&A about medical abuses is that almost no historical moment or event or trend exists in a vacuum or bracketed, and every event that you could possibly talk about has some sort of impact in the modern day, and this subject more than many. And so, of course, I think there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid to disability studies currently and how we can further help support and advocate for people with disabilities and listen to them as well.
Yeah,
which is why I'm so glad we did this.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, even at the beginning, that a lot of these ideas are still present. I would recommend, there's actually in my research, my kind of moving forward research that I conducted, I found a really great article from the Los Angeles Times that was published last year, where the reporter actually interviewed disabled mothers who were working in the medical field. And it was really important for me to see their experiences as both medical professionals, but also as disabled women living in this world. So I found that article really important. I know I can't remember the name of the reporter, but if you search through the Los Angeles Times, you'd be able to find it. It was published, I think, September of 2021. So important, such a great article. If I find it, I'll try and send it to you, Kevin, so you can post it in the comment section of YouTube if it's recorded and posted. But that's it's a really intriguing look at disabled women as they work in the medical profession, but also as they live their everyday lives as disabled mothers and what they experience in American society. And a lot of these ideas, it was really the connections with this research that is, over 100 years ago. Some of it is still very relevant to today and standards of motherhood, even in today's society. And while strides have been made, and I'm so thankful the strides have been made in supporting disabled mothers, that article really showed that there's a long way to go.
And that's one of your lasting legacies of the DAR Museum, as Patrick and I have talked about a couple times already, is that we have so much space and so many things here to have so many great discussions. And we'd like to have more discussions about historical disability, women with disability, to more fully understand, a broad question of who was an American, what were they like, that's going to include disabled people of all different kinds of varieties. And it's so exciting, I think, that there's just always more stories to tell.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Make sure we don't have any more. If anyone has any another question, another share in the chat here. Just Sarah Elizabeth with a DAR member whose patriot was a female, which is always good to see. But just that very grateful for speaking about this issue, and as am I. And again, it's just always reminding people that these are, when we study these, they always end up being current issues if you spend long enough with them, and sometimes you don't spend that long with them to see that. So.
Absolutely.
Becca,
so thank you for those words, Sarah Elizabeth, and thank you for all of the comments, the couple of other comments that were thanking me. I appreciate that. Just thank you, Kevin, for allowing me to have this platform to speak on this, because disability history, in my opinion, does not oftentimes get the platform that it should. So thank you, and thank you to the DAR Museum for providing that platform to have deeper discussions and conversations about disability history. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think something you realize as a historian is, you think as a young person that surely we've talked about everything now. And then I think something that's both inspiring and disheartening is how untrue that is. And disability history is certainly something that goes unexplored largely at this point. So I'm just glad to be part of the cutting edge. All right, well, I think we'll wrap up for the day. Becca, did you have any last thoughts you want to share, or resources, anything like that?
Not in particular. I will say that if you're interested in learning more about disability history, unfortunately, there aren't any really bricks and mortar museums dedicated to disability history. There are a couple of more virtual museums that talk about disability history. Encourage you to go take a look at those. And if you're interested in learning more about the Buck v. Bell case, Dr. Paul Lombardo he wrote a book about it, and it's so there's so much to see and so much to read about. He also did a lecture on it, and if you search Dr. Paul Lombardo, University of Michigan, I think was where it was at, in YouTube, you can find it's about an hour-long lecture where he actually talks more deeply about Buck v. Bell and its implications on American society. So that's a great resource as well, either his book, if that's how you like to absorb information, or his lecture, if that's how you prefer to absorb information. So I'd also recommend Dr. Paul Lombardo to talk about Buck v. Bell a little bit more thoroughly.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everyone who's joined us here today. And be sure to tune in for the rest of the month. We'll have more things that we'll be sharing for Women's History Month.